That will be for Lauren. So
Yeah.
Lauren has 3 degrees of multiple positions here. She has gone to sea several times. She has flown drones in the Switzerland glacier. She recently went to Costa Rica, and she is heading up our drones and geoscience program here and has done quite a bit in geology education and taken us into the 2020s going forward. Our second speaker is Carol McCarty, who got her undergraduate degree and a master's in art history, and her subject of her thesis was the Geology Museum. This year, the Geology Museum turned 150 years old, and I will not try to tell any stories about it because I'm sure that Lauren and Carol will give us more than I think I know on it. So I hand it off to Carol.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just try one thing before we start. Sorry about that. Let's get this back up here, and let's hope that. Oh, whoa, that got dark. Matt, there's one more. Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. Use slideshow. There, okay. Are we good to go?
You can hide the Zoom stuff, but that's okay.
You would think we would have this set after how long of being in pandemic, but here we are. So thank you, Jim, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Carol, for all the hard work she's been doing and is doing right now with the Geology Museum, which she will talk a little bit about today. So yes, I'm at the museum. Obviously my background is in science, but this project that was actually published in a paper in 2018, I joked with our co-authors that I felt like it was my master's in history because I learned how to do history research and how to write a history paper in a journal. So I feel like I got my crash course in being a history student doing this project. Yep. Ken says it's good. Okay, so I'll come back to the 150th, but I'm glad that I got to do this year because we fought Rutgers very hard to get a logo. As you know, Rutgers doesn't give out logos very easily. So check out and admire our 150th anniversary logo that we have to stop using in a couple months. So anyway, to understand how and why the Geology Museum was started, you have to know a little bit about how geology was started in Europe and also in the United States. So most of these studies and most of the original geologists back in the 1800s, late 1700s were from Europe. That's where they were trained. And it really came from the integration of 3 different fields. So there was the debates about the origin of natural history things. So where did these fossils come from? How did things change over time? These are, things that we might consider Earth's history now, and understanding how environments changed over time. So the second one would be just the classification of things. So collecting minerals and fossils and other natural history items into collections and trying to organize them. And the third, and probably the most important, which led to the field of geology as an official science, is mining, because that's where the money came from and why governments particularly were interested in creating geological societies and surveys, and why universities created departments and things. So the first speculative maps of the United States were presented in the mid-1700s. And like I said, all of the early geologists were trained in Europe. I'm not going to go into super depth about these early geologists. There is many papers and books out there about these very important people who really started the science. I'm just going to mention a couple of them that are important for this story. So Samuel Mitcham, he is important. He was one of the ones that first published on the geology of the United States. So he talked about the geology of New York in particular. And so he actually came here and was taught chemistry and natural history at Columbia in the late 1700s. And so again, another point to understand is that these early classes weren't specifically geology, they often encompassed a lot of different departments, and usually they were combined with chemistry and how it related to mineralogy. So like mineralogy, chemistry, natural history were all integrally, connected when they were first being taught. So this is a name you might have heard of, William McClure. He first published geologic maps of of North America in 1809. It was first published in the very first U.S. geology textbook by Cleveland, and here's a picture of what you can see. And those of us who are familiar with geologic maps, it looks familiar. We understand that the colors represent different geologic units. If you zoom in, it is very general compared to what our geologic maps look like now. But that being said, if you look at New Jersey in particular, the 4 main units and geologic units of New Jersey are there. Whether the exact boundaries are correct and the details within that are obviously have been updated since this was published, but the general broad strokes of the geology are there. And again, these were all hand colored, so they were maps, and then he colored in the geology based on observations that he made and from observations from other people, from journals and things like that. Okay, so again, that's 1816 is when the first geology textbook was created. Geology articles, so published articles, start appearing around the same time in the American Journal of Science. And then most importantly, in the 1830s, this is when the states recognize the value of geology in terms of understanding their mineral resources and wanting to make their own geological surveys. So in the 1830s, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey all start their own geological surveys. So around this time, we also have cabinets of curiosities are a trend in natural history and natural sciences. You might have heard the term Wunderkammern before. It means like cabinet of wonders, cabinet of curiosities. These are basically natural history collections where people collected all sorts of things that had anything to do with natural history. So these would be fossils, these would be like taxidermy, animals from modern things, they would be shell fragments, modern shells, fossil shells, modern bones, fossil bones, Indian artifacts, all kinds of natural history things. And they were displayed in these rooms where it was just every surface of these museums, or lyceums they were sometimes called, were covered with these artifacts. So this is kind of, all this stuff is where museums of natural history started from. So the other part, oh, Siri, I don't need you to talk anything to me. The other part of this is the public was interested in geology. They wanted to understand what was going on around them. They wanted to learn about the rocks around them, learn about the resources that they were in their backyard. So many universities recognized that students were starting to ask for these lectures. So this is what happened here at Rutgers. And these are actually, oops, where's the thing? I don't know if you can, I can't really see that. So these are from the archives at the library, showing some of these early public natural history lectures that were offered here at the university. And again, these were requested by the students. They asked the university to put on these lectures. So you can see there's I don't know what the date of this is, but a Natural History Society, and where the students asked for the university to bring lectures in to talk about the science. So the first person that did that here at the university was John Finch, and that was in 1829. So John Finch, he was from Europe, Great Britain, and he was a geologist trained there. He came here to the university, and the student society requested that he teach a course on geology. So he was hired to give the first lecture series here at Rutgers in the 1830s. So it was about 15 lectures. And he didn't get the job to actually be the first geology professor. He wanted it, but the university went with someone else. So the other, and I'll get to that in a minute, but the other thing that happened this time is that the students petitioned to have money to create the very first cabinet of specimens. So they requested funds, and it was actually on display in, this is Voorhees Hall, I'm sorry, Van Nest Hall, sorry, I forgot. Van Nest Hall, which is right next to the Geology Museum on Old Queens campus. And this is the place where the first collection, so this is pretty much the origin of the Geology Museum, is this first cabinet of minerals that was on display in Van Nest Hall in the 1830s. That actually predates the museum, which I don't know if we have actually records of what these do. Have you seen any records of what these were? Okay, so that's another thing. We want to know what were these these earliest collections of the museum and of the sorry, I can't get the words out. My brain is going too fast. Of the university. So, like I said, the university did not hire John Finch as the first professor. They hired Louis Beck instead. So this is a name you've probably heard before. Beck Hall on Livingston campus is named after him. So he was hired as the very first natural history and chemistry professor at Rutgers. And again, remember I said that there's that connection between natural history and chemistry and mineralogy. So he was a very typical early geologist, that they were a jack of all trades, that they studied botany, they studied biology, they studied chemistry, and they kind of taught a little bit of everything. He was an avid mineral collector. He had a personal mineral collection of over 3,000 minerals, which actually was donated to the university, and we still have those on display at the Geology Museum. And he actually did a lot of this collecting in New York, and especially New York, but other areas in the tri-state area. And so a lot of these places were collected when they were doing construction. So like he did a lot of work along when the Erie Canal was built and dug, and he collected samples. So these samples that we have at the university represent places that just don't exist for geologic areas anymore because they've been built over or mined out. So the Beck collection is considered the oldest scientific collection here at the university, and it's still on display. And the important part is that when this was together, the university really put an emphasis on displaying these minerals and these collections because it was showing all of the work that the university was doing at the time. And again, we still have these on display. So this is an image from the paper that we published that we see a couple examples of some of these Beck minerals. And I know you can't read this, but these are scans from his handwritten journals that are on in the archives at Rutgers, where we can match up where he said he collected the sample to the actual sample that we still have in this, the collection. So this is something that Carol might want to look at later, but yes, this is the level of detail, the history we can get down to. Okay, so George Cook, mid-1800s. Most people think of Cook for agriculture. This crowd here might already know that he was a geologist first. Right, so his agriculture titles came later. He was trained as a geologist in New York. He actually did not earn a PhD. He was given an honorary PhD in geology, and he actually was given that before there were any earned PhDs in the country for that field. So that was to recognize how much he had done in the field of geology at the time. He came to the university, I forget exactly what year, so 1853. He taught other places in New York before he came here, but he was also the state geologist of New Jersey. So he was very integral in creating geology here at the university and also in the state. So in 1864, led by Cook and some other people at the university, they petitioned the university to try to get the land grant status. And as you know, we are a land grant institution. Rutgers won the status of land grant institution over Princeton, and then the State Normal School in Trenton were the two competitors for this status. So what the Morrill Act is that when the federal government sold federal lands, that those universities would get funds from that. But in order to get those funds, they had to make certain improvements to the university to meet the requirements. So the things that they had to do in order to meet those were build the museum. They also bought Cook Campus, which became the Experimental Agricultural Station, which is what we know as Cook Campus today. There's also a small observatory that was built. So those three things were improvements the university had to make to get the land grant status. So without this, the Geology Hall, the museum, would not have been built. So the museum was built in 1872, 150 years ago. And when it was opened, it was not just geology, it was also home to physics and military science. So the main part of the museum where the collections are has always been the museum, but there was used to be a lecture hall beneath that where classes were taught, and there was actually an armory in the basement where military science was taught. Obviously not anymore. So these are just some historic photos showing, here's Geology Hall from, different views in the past. The Schenck Observatory is the small astronomical observatory that's still there today. They just went through a major renovation a couple years ago, which you can do tours of, but that was also built around the same time. So other interesting tidbits. If you've been to the museum, you've seen our mastodon on display, which it is from New Jersey. It's from Mannington, New Jersey. It's a semi-complete skeleton. Some of it is replicas because they didn't find every bone when they found the skeleton. But this skeleton was purchased by George Cook in 1870. However, it took until 1892 for it to be mounted and on display in the museum. Obviously still there today, but George Cook didn't get to see it on display because he passed away before it was fully articulated and mounted in the museum. And another little fact, that was purchased for $300. There's actually a copy of the sales receipt in the archives showing the purchase of this item by George Cook. So anyway, how does this relate to the rest of the country with their museums? So I mentioned the Wonder Commons and the Lyceums and how people were collecting these things. So it initially started as like personal collections. Maybe a society would collect the things. But then in the 1800s, it started to transfer to more university or bigger institutions being the ones that collected these minerals and fossils and things. So a lot of them were sold off to bigger museums. A lot of them were donated to other places. We tried to find a list of all these early lyceums and Wonder Commons. It just doesn't exist because there were so many of them at the time. But we put together a list of what were the earliest museums that we can find on record. So these are, in the 1800s, when these natural history museums started to be officially established. We are not the oldest natural history museum in the country. However, we are the earliest one that specifically is designating it as geology. So that's why we like to say we're the first, the oldest geology museum in the country. And we are certainly one of the oldest geology museums at universities, right, in the United States. So some other early years, and this is something Kara will talk about in a second, so I won't talk too much longer so I can give her time. After Cook passed, A.H. Chester was hired to be the curator of the museum. He was also chemistry, mineralogy professor. He was at Hamilton College and then came here for the end of his career. He also was an avid mineral collector in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, etc. And he had a personal collection of, over 5,000 minerals that were donated to the museum. And we do still have the Chester collection as part of the historic collections today. And you can see many of them are currently on display at the museum right now. So the other big thing that you see when you come to the museum is the spider crab. This was a gift to the university from the Japanese government. I think it was like 1899 is when it was given to, because Rutgers was one of the only universities that would accept Japanese students at the time. So this was given as a gift of goodwill. And so you can see this historic photo with Valiant, which Carol will talk about. He was one of the curators as well. And it was on display here until the 80s, where it fell apart, and then we actually restored the skeleton in about 2012, and it is back on display here in the museum too. So just a little bit of why the museum was important. Yes, it's a museum, you can go see pretty minerals on display, but the museum was how geology and natural history, mineralogy, chemistry was taught during this time. So there was no department yet, okay? It was only the museum. The curators and the professors were in the museum, and they would come to the museum and they would observe all the minerals and fossils, just like we do in labs today, at the museum. So you can see, this is a historic photo with all the original cabinets. You can see, hundreds of minerals and fossils lined up. So the classes occurred here. So this was geology education at the time, okay? And just some other historic photos. We don't have the right whale skeleton anymore, but there was a whale skeleton that did hang from the ceiling of the museum. It is no longer there. It decayed, it was not preserved properly, so it rotted. We don't have it. We would love to get one back, but we need a donor to buy us a whale replica before that can happen. Anyway, so just another cool picture looking what the inside of the museum, and some of these things that you see in these historic photos, like these are the trackways. We still have these things on with dinosaur footprints in the background. We'll have those on display at the museum. So how does, I don't know why there's that block right there, I apologize for that. How does the department fit into this? Well, there was no department of geology until 1931. So the department first started in 1931, and there are many people that were involved, and you can see Dick Olson. He was integral in developing the department to what we have today. So until the 1970s, the department was in the museum. So all the professors had offices there, and it was run out of the museum. And it wasn't until the 70s where there was a split, right, where the museum obviously stayed there and the department came over here. I think it's important for us to realize that the department is here because of the stuff that was started from the museum. So obviously there's a different focus where the museum is no longer doing active research on the collections. It's an educational and outreach facility, and obviously we do all the research here. But the department grew out from the museum. And this is just a picture. If you recognize this guy right here, does anybody? It's Dick Olson, a much younger Dick Olson. I have no idea what year that is, but it's probably from the 60s. This is when the mummy came to the museum, which was sometime in the 60s. And these are just some other historic photos that Dick gave me. So I will turn it over to Carol. And I apologize, we have to switch the microphone, so bear with us. All right. Sorry.
So thanks, Lauren. And thanks everyone for having me. So as Dr. Wright said, the Geology Museum was the subject of my master's thesis here at Rutgers. And I continued that research, now focusing on the collections. I'm sorry, let me just clip this on. So now I'm focusing on the collections, and about a year ago I had the opportunity to go to Special Collections and University Archives at Alexander Library and see William Valiant's papers. So that's basically what I'm going to concentrate on today, but then also end with some of the current stuff that I'm doing. So William Valiant, he was born in 1845 in Rome, New York. He was a pivotal figure in the history of the Rutgers Geology Museum because he was really the first person that organized the collections into a functioning museum. When he was young, Valiant's mother taught him early in life. She was a botanist and really gave Valiant his first lessons in books and natural history of their home region in Rome, New York. And so by the time he was 8 years old in 1858, he took to the fields and the woods and began what he called a lifelong search for stone trophies. So this slide is a newspaper article that tells in rather gruesome detail how William Valiant lost his arm left arm in a mill accident where he worked. It states that, the amazing fact was that he not only lost his arm, but that he survived this complicated surgery. And in his papers, Valiant stated that he was up and about in about 3 weeks after the incident. And that was the time when he attended his first and only term of school in 1862. But then he decided to go back to the mill and work another 15 years. But while working at the mill, he continued searching for geological treasures on his days off. So he decided he needed to find a written guide to help him in his searches, and so he struck up a correspondence with James Dana, who wrote Dana's Manual of Mineralogy and Geology. And this led to an introduction to many of the scholars and people within that discipline, as well as the New York State geologist James Hall. So he was really establishing relationships with people in the discipline. And by 1875, he began classifying and cataloging private collections in the Rome, New York area. In 1884, he by chance found a fossil of a trilobite with its legs intact in Rome, New York. And that was a big deal because at the time, scientists suspected that trilobites had appendages, but they had no fossilized evidence that they actually had appendages. So this was a big deal that he found a partial fossil and decided to spend the next 8 years searching, and finally found an intact specimen in 1892. So he decided to take the specimens that he found and send them to different scientists in the area. And one landed at Yale, and a young professor by the name of Charles Beecher saw the specimen, got in touch with Valiant, and immediately decided to take a lease on the land, and had Valiant tell him exactly where he found the samples. And Beecher excavated that land between 1893 and 1895 with really successful results. So these images are from Yale. I actually contacted them and spoke to one of the curators. And the image on the left is a trilobite sample that Beecher collected from that time period, and you can see it's pyritized. And the one on the right is another type of sample that Valiant sent to Beecher around the same time as well. And this photo shows William Valiant, which you can see over here right by the V, and his brother Sid Mitchell right by the M, at the exact place where they found the trilobites. And he made a little X. This is actually Valiant who wrote on this photo. And that's the X right over there. X marks the spot. That's where he found the specimens. So this was taken just before Rutgers contacted him. So Rutgers professor Albert Huntington Chester, which Lauren mentioned, contacts Valiant a few months after this photo is taken in 1892 and asks him to come to Rutgers and take charge of the museum and the collections here. He accepts the job and arrives at Rutgers with his wife on April 6th, 1893. So this is a page from some of his papers. I mean, hundreds of handwritten papers. In his descriptions of his time at Rutgers, it's clear that Valiant's rather shocked by the state of the Rutgers Geology Museum when he gets here. He states that the original condition of the museum was beyond description and likens it to a moving day after a fire. So it sounds like Rutgers got all of these specimens and all of these donations, but then no one had the time to really organize them. So that was why Valiant was hired. In general, he was tasked with clearing up, classifying, labeling everything pertaining to geology in the museum at a salary of $40 per month, half of which was paid personally by Professor Chester. He had a short period of organization because there were no classified collections of any kind at that point that could be used to support lectures in the classroom. So right off the bat, Valiant talks about the fact that he made separate systematic arrangements for rocks, fossils, and minerals so that they could be used in time for that fall 1893 term. And he also, one other thing that was really funny, he changed all the locks in the museum because when he arrived, it took over 100 keys to open all of the different cabinets. And he just thought that that was ridiculous. So he talked about how he reduced that to a more manageable 10 keys. So Valiant says that this work went on for about 6 years when, he quotes, when the entire mass was reduced to something like a respectable museum. And one of his official duties was to keep the museum open, so a free museum open for anyone to come and to welcome them and to explain the collections to them. So while he was supposed to be organizing this museum and this entire mass of things that were there, that work had to stop when people came to visit. And he seemed to really love that part of it. He seemed to really like connecting with people and explaining sort of the science behind all of these specimens. The weather affected the work as well, as Lauren, I'm sure you can attest to, because while the museum still doesn't have air conditioning, at this point it didn't have heat either. So it was either really, really hot in the summer or really cold in the winter. So at those points, he couldn't work then either. So in addition to also delving into the collections, he also started researching the origin of the collections and of the origin of the museum, really, by learning about the activities of the Rutgers Natural History Society, which Lauren also mentioned. It was a student-run society, and there actually are, so you asked me, there actually are papers at special collections and university archives of all of the meetings of the Natural History Society. So that is on my, that's not me, okay. So that is on my long list of things to go and look at there as well. So not only did Valiant know everything about the collections, but then he started also understanding the history, so that by the time those 6 years were over, he really knew everything about the museum and what was in it. So in 1899 and 1900, Valiant wrote a detailed description of the museum and the collections and has these photos taken of the interior and also the ones that Lauren used as well. Valiant distributes this as a pamphlet for the museum and paid for the printing and the postage to distribute the pamphlet himself. And considering how he described the state of the museum when he arrived, when I look at these photos of this gleaming, orderly museum, I imagine that this must have been a big moment of pride for Valiant, because he took something that was like, as he described, a mess after a fire, like sort of after a fire, and turned it into this. It was a beautiful, orderly museum where people could not only come and visit and have access to those collections, but also students were regularly learning there on a daily basis. And he also notes that after public school hours, he says many boys and girls come in, some from curiosity and others to play, but most of them learn something. Some of them make a mess of the register, but we can't refuse them. So can you imagine being like a school kid in New Brunswick and just running yourself over there and having William Valiant sort of stop and teach you a few things? I thought that was really cool. And at this point, Valiant estimates the museum collections included about 20,000 specimens and averaged about 3,000 visitors per year. So by this point, Valiant had also started regularly contributing articles on the museum and its collection to a periodical for the discipline called Mineral Collector. Here you can see the editor of Mineral Collector decided to honor Valiant's work by publishing his photo in the December 1898 issue with a note about some of the work he had done without Valiant's knowledge. So this speaks to the relationships that Valiant had really started to make within the discipline. And he basically finished the initial organization of the museum, but there were always additions to the collection by gift, exchange, or purchase. So the organization and the work that Valiant was doing would always continue. He revised the Beck and the Cook and the Chester collections, and in 1906, heat was finally installed in the museum. So he was also thrilled to report in his papers that the museum was kept warm for the first time in the winter of 1906-07. And that year also a desk laboratory with gas connections was installed. So Valiant proudly also declared that with that addition, the museum was equipped with everything needed to really be one of the best mineralogical laboratories around. In 1909, Valiant wrote a 24-page handwritten report to Rutgers President Demarest, providing a detailed history of the museum and all it contains. He states in the report that he was brought here to Rutgers because he knew how, not to learn how, and that this 24-page report really represents a lifetime of work. So he estimates at this point that there are about 30,000 specimens in the collection, that he's written at least 50,000 labels over the years. And in this report, Valiant also directly questions his title of assistant curator. He's very salty at this point. As I know these are a lot of words to put up on a slide, but he says 16 years of hard work and study. We have not been able to graduate or obtain a diploma or a degree. The name assistant is as good as far as it goes. But who has written a larger thesis? Are not the labels, records, and abundant evidence of scientific work in this museum much more than a thesis? The usual thesis is prepared for after nearly 4 years of college work is done and may take a few weeks to prepare. How will that compare with 40 years in the field and 16 years in a public museum, and the association with professors, students, scientific specialists from everywhere and all kinds of visitors for 16 years, and assistants still? So, like I said, I know there's a lot of words to put up there, but I felt like it was important for all of you to understand that Valiant was really frustrated at this point in his life. He had put in a lot of work and a lot of dedication, and he really felt like he was being shortchanged and his work wasn't really being respected. So the report that I just mentioned also references a 1,000 handwritten page manuscript that Valiant wrote. And this is a picture of the manuscript here, almost 1,000 pages, and it lives in special collections, university archives. I've read parts of it. I read the important parts right before special collections got closed down after the hurricane last year. So, but in it, he devotes 2 chapters to relics, one on relics that have already been found in the New Brunswick area at that point, and another one called Relics to be Sought by Future Collectors. And it's sort of a suggestion on where to look for relics in the New Brunswick area in 2020. So I've been telling Lauren I really think this ought to be a field trip at the museum to sort of follow what Valiant says. I love that one. So the last title of that 1,000-page manuscript was titled, What is an Education? And Valiant devotes 25 pages in this chapter to really rather bitter musings on the meaning of formal education. And here we have another window into his personal opinions. And while you could say that his lack of formal education was a regret of his, I think it's equally accurate to say that Valiant vehemently believed that a formal education was not the only path, and that he's bitter because he feels like he's been passed over and not respected because of his lack of formal education. In 1913, he does finally get promoted to curator instead of assistant curator. But by 1918, he's tired and wants to retire, and he and his wife want to go back to Rome, New York. So I want to circle back to, am I running out of time? Am I okay? I want to circle back to the story about Beecher's bed and the trilobites. Right now, we're in 1920, and as I mentioned before, Beecher excavated the bed, got a lot of samples, got a lot of specimens from the bed, continued his research until his death in 1904, and then one of his students picked up the research, Percy Raymond, and then he went on to finally publish in 1920 a combination of Beecher's research and his own. And this highlighted area shows that Valiant is credited with being the first to discover what would become the famous Beecher's bed and a critical source for intact specimens of trilobites. And I learned from a collections manager at Yale that Valiant's role in this discovery and the subsequent research is quite well known. So I thought that was very nice that he finally got honored. So in the end, although he was frustrated and probably disappointed with some of the aspects of his life, colleagues and professors who came to the museum in the years after Valiant would say that his was a life of usefulness. William Valiant's papers are incredibly rich with detail and information, and this archive of Valiant's professional life and work at the Rutgers Geology Museum is invaluable. It's an invaluable resource for people like me who study the museum and its place in the history of Rutgers. His papers give us a window into his personal life, but they give a very clear snapshot in time of what was in the collection at the time and sort of give us this historical record of what the Rutgers Geology Museum did. And so now I want to go to the work that I'm currently doing. So I told you that I'm researching the collections and I'm currently doing a full inventory of the collections. So something like this will hopefully be online and accessible to everyone on the World Wide Web to be able to see all of the collections at the Rutgers Geology Museum. But what's really cool about this particular photograph, so these are all the things that we're finding. So very often there'll be a specimen and then it'll have several labels. And you can see that the labels do repeat the information. But I want to focus on this one label. This was so cool. I found it maybe 2 weeks ago. And it really gives you an idea of a lot of information besides the actual specimen. We know that, for example, it was part of the Lewis Beck cabinet. So this was part of the original, earliest scientific collection at Rutgers. It gives evidence of the work that William Valiant did. So remember, I told you he reclassified, relabeled. This was reclassified and relabeled by William Valiant, summer of 1896. So it's another confirmation of what he talks about in his papers. Revised again in 1906. I said that he went back through the collection and looked at everything all over again. And then the labels were typewritten in 1916 by Miss Mina Valiant. I also know from some letters that he wrote to President Demarest, he asked President Demarest for permission to hire his daughter to type all of his reports and the labels because he was tired of writing the labels himself. So these are the kinds of things that I'm finding as I'm doing this inventory and in the middle of off-site storage over on Livingston. It's clear evidence of everything that I found in the archives, and it's just so cool to find it all together. And thank you so much for having me. And if you have any, I don't know if we have time for questions, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we have time for questions. Like Carol said, she's currently working with a bevy of undergrads and some grad students who are inventorying, what do we think, like 30,000, 40,000
Something like that. I don't know. I actually realized that the other day when I was looking at all of the lines in the inventory spreadsheet and then sort of looking at all the, there's a lot.
Ken, you have a question?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know about William Valiant. And in Albert Hayes' memorial to him in Science, which he quoted, the line before that says, 2 articles in Geology of the Rutgers campus appeared in the Rutgers Targum in April and May 1898. Have you ever found those?
Actually, yes, I've found a bunch of articles about him, and he's all over the place in terms of both mineral collector and in the Targum.
It'd be interesting from a historical perspective to see how they describe the geology of this campus back in the day.
Yeah, I think there's a chapter in the manuscript about it too.
I told her this is her next paper that she's writing up the history of Valiant, because this is all new in like what, last year or so that she's discovered.
Yeah.
Is there a question online?
Yeah, Vera is wondering, does the Army Corps of Engineers have any joint history with the museum?
I don't know. I'm sure there might be like samples. I'm not aware of it, but
they had there was an office at the Geology Museum, but I'm not sure if it was the Army. I don't think it was the Army Corps of Engineers, but I'm blanking on what it was. But yeah, there may be some history there. I mean, truly, I went into the special collections in last September, and I was really limited on time because they were moving collections. So I probably saw 20% of what I could have. And we just have to, that's the next phase of the project once we have everything photographed.
There might be something with the Cook stuff because Cook was the state geologist. So
right.
there most likely is some connection with that stuff, but
Yeah.
I've been to the archives and dove through the archives, but not to the extent that Carol.
And like I said, I've only done maybe 20% of it, so that's the next phase.
Jim.
Can you talk about the architecture and the building of geology?
Well, Carlo Yanni's better at that, but I can a little bit. I mean, is there anything in particular you want to know? Or, I mean, the museum area is fairly original, except for those offices, that little bay of offices that's in there. The interior of the museum part is fairly original. The first floor, like Lauren said, I think it actually had more than one lecture hall, and as well as laboratories, and just really it was state of the art for that time. I mean, it was a big deal. And then in the basement, they had the armory, of course.
Do you know who built it? Or?
Oh, yeah. So that's actually a famous person. Hardenberg built that. He also built the Plaza in New York City, and I think the Dakota. What?
No, sorry, the Dakota building. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. So he was a famous architect at the time, actually. And Kirkpatrick. He did Kirkpatrick too. So
Hardenberg, he was, I think, the grandson of one of the
Yeah.
presidents of the university. which is why he got
great-grandson of the
job.
first. Great-grandson, of the first
See,
president.
New Jersey has changed so much, right? So
So yeah, no, and it was also, I mean, in terms of building it, the one catch, like Lauren mentioned, was that the land grant funds could not be used to build the buildings, and so that was actually from money raised. They raised about $120,000 as for like the centennial celebration because at that point they didn't realize that the charter was actually in 1766. They thought it was in 1770. So in 1870 they did this big, we're 100 years old, let's donate, everybody donate so that we can celebrate the centennial. And then half of that money was used to build the Geology Museum. And I've seen the actual handwritten records from the Board of Governors making those decisions on these little scraps of paper, literally.
and it was wildly over budget too, I think, right?
I didn't see
That's
that.
what I saw
Okay.
that somewhere in one of the history books. So yeah. You're just stretching.
Just stretching, trying not to put my hand up.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that there's less of a focus now on active research at the museum, more on outreach. But I was wondering if you see any opportunities to use the depth of the collections to do still science. Like, are there things
Yeah.
you really do?
Yeah, so that's part of the reason why Carol is doing this inventory. So there's, multiple layers and reasons of why, and why Jim is graciously funding Carol this semester to do some of this work, so that that we'll have the full archive, right, and that it will be inventoried of what's there and also where it is in the cabinets, so that that can be done. Any research that people would want to do on minerals, and I'm hoping, like Carol said, having it online, but I have some students that are working with me now that are doing 3D models of minerals, so I'm hoping to digitize that way some of these collections as well, which that will be a very long process for this, but we'll pick and choose which one. So yes, that's like what, phase 2 or 3 of what we
well,
our
that
grand plans?
ultimately the idea is to really establish a collections management plan that allows, because the interdisciplinary possibilities are enormous too. It's not only scientists that would be interested in this. Sometimes when I'm looking at these collections, I'm like, but Lauren, can't we just put the whole Beck collection together in one place? Because for me as a historian, it's exciting to see sort of in the archive that this existed, and then here it is today. And so
we're having discussions on mineral classifications, because you can see as time went by, the classification systems changed, and so it was originally by collector, and then some efforts were changed to silicates are together in this group. So there's a lot of there's a lot more to be done.
I chose the iron cabinet, and it wasn't too fun. It was really heavy.
Yeah.
those drawers.
Yeah, Luigi was wondering, I'm just wondering what the future holds for the museum museum. Is the museum getting continual support from the higher-ups at Rutgers? Are there any plans to expand the collection?
Oh, you just wait. I have a grand plan. I'm
Yeah.
just kidding.
So a little bit about the structure. So the museum and the collections are actually separate. So the collections actually belong to us, to the department. So, and then the museum is run by a different thing, but the collections are on loan to the museum, the ones that are on display. So this effort to inventory is being led by Carol and the history department, and I'm helping oversee it. And she's doing the work. I'm just the geologist that she asks questions, right? So
Yeah.
as far as the museum, we don't have enough time to go down that rabbit hole right now, but yes, we there is plans, and we had gotten funding from the university to do a feasibility study and to create blueprints and plans to renovate the museum, because we really want to take over more space in that building, because we only have a very small space. We have the museum and like one room in the bottom, and then there's other people in the first floor and basement. We would love to restore it more to its original, where that first floor is more of a classroom, a lecture hall that could be an interactive classroom. We would love to have it handicap accessible, which is a big problem since it is a historic building. But we literally got the estimates a couple weeks before COVID of what the price tags were, and so obviously that has not been on anyone's priority list right now. So that is something that we are trying to bring the discussions up again.
Well, Ben and Paul and almost all of the graduate students in here, 10 years ago, we had a vice something of undergraduate education who saw the Geology Museum as the perfect 21st century classroom and wanted to get rid of everything and turn it into a multimedia
Yeah, it was not a fun
classroom.
time.
So it has been undersought. That location is coveted by administrators, and so far, maybe the price of renovation is the only thing that has, or one of the things that has saved it in its current form. But I
And
think
public outcry too. The last time when Jim was talking about, there was a huge letter writing campaign that went through that.
Which actually I used in my thesis.
Yeah, which stopped it, I think, because they
Yeah.
overwhelmed Archie of like, you can't do this. So, but yeah, Jim is right. They look next door and they see this prized Old Queens area, and they, so that it does come under attack every couple, 10 to 20 years. But yeah,
Yeah,
everyone knows a big donor that wants to sponsor a modern education center. Any other questions? And hopefully there'll be more, so when Carol gets through this collection, there'll be some fun things that maybe she can report of what,
Yeah.
now that we've done this inventory, what do we have? And
Yeah.
yeah. And people who are interested in mineralogy, we'd love to talk to you in the future of what can be done with those type of things. So. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.